Welcome back to WeTalking, the podcast where we explore Caribbean manhood, culture, and responsibility through real conversations. Today, WeTalking is partnering with High Commissions of Canada across the Caribbean for a special 16 Days of Activism episode. We're examining how digital spaces are shaping masculinity, identity, and power, and also how these same spaces are increasingly exposing girls to grooming, exploitation, and digital violence. Today, we're joined by experts from across the region in research, advocacy, policy, and youth development. We have Colleen from Jamaica, Peter from Barbados, Dr. Husbands from Guyana, and joining us from the High Commission in Port of Spain is Stuart. So, without further ado, let's jump straight into the episode.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Kona Husbands. I am the manager of the Sexual Offences and Domestic Violence Unit at the Ministry of Human Services and Social Security here in Guyana, and I lead all things relating to gender based violence across the country.
Hi, morning. I'm Colleen Whitbond. I'm the project coordinator with the Violence Prevention Alliance, Jamaica. And we have a project called WeTalk project, and our focus is on boys and men, and we call it Big Man Thing.
Okay, my name is Peter Wickham. I'm a political consultant and also principal director of Cadres. Here speaking largely on behalf of UNICEF with respect to some work that we've done on cyberbullying across the Caribbean region.
All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Stuart Shaw. I'm the Political and Public Affairs Counselor at the Canadian High Commission in Trinidad and Tobago. I'm really excited to be here to join the conversation.
Based on your sector, research, advocacy, what is digital violence?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to define it. But from you say online, you're talking about those spaces like mobile phones, the various apps that exist that people can use, whether it's TikTok or whatever. But it's the use or probably abuse of those platforms by people to whether it's threaten or to intimidate. And I'm just throwing this out. I'm sure Dr. Husbands, you have more official definition of such things, but just in terms of the work that we do, it is about individuals trying to use these spaces because they reach such a wide range of viewers and listeners, to whether it's to intimidate, to shame, to hurt somebody's reputation, all of these things. And very often, we know the psychological or psychosocial and sometimes economic repercussions they can have.
As it relates to digital violence, there is a very broad definition. So I know I applaud the UN for actually raising that as the theme for 2025 because it's very relevant in this age. Digital violence is basically, in a nutshell, is any form of violence perpetrated against somebody using telecommunications or some form of communications network. It doesn't have to be social media. It could also be your phone. Somebody could be stalking you on your phones. So it spreads widely. I mean, the popular ones are cyberbullying, cyber stalking, but we also do have areas whereby persons can be sharing unwanted photographs. That is a form of digital violence. We have child pornography. We have something called where persons in power are attacked. These persons, like prominent women, men, children, a lot are attacked online. We call it, but it's cyberbullying as well. And we also have some sinister ways where persons can like hack into your phones and hack into your cameras and do unlawful videoing with the younger girls, women and girls. And mainly it's the popular cyberbullying, cyber stalking. Persons go online, they're creating fake profiles. There's identity theft, there's duplication of profiles. And these persons are targeted, and this speaks to more so emotional abuse and also verbal abuse, because some persons go online and they would call them fat shaming, shameful names, bashing persons online. So you see a lot of that with our younger population. What is emerging, I'm not sure for the other Caribbean countries as they can speak, is that what we're seeing is that people are using the social media as a form of like a public outcry. So they would record information and upload it and share it. And that's what we're seeing a lot of sharing of violence, of persons being physically abused, persons being even sexual abuse. We're actually seeing those becoming coming more and more. And this is something two intimate partners might do privately, but then it's all over social media. So there is a trend. I mean, like as I said, I can speak for here and a few other countries that I follow. But I mean, that's what we're seeing here. And as I said, we do have the identity theft, creating fake profiles, stalking persons, and so forth. That is very much common right now in our society, especially in the Caribbean.
So, Peter, based on the research that you would have done with UNICEF, what did the findings show, and did anything surprise you?
I was actually quite pleased. UNICEF does a regional study on violence against children generally, and we've done a couple of them in the past. This year, we did another iteration, and this was the first time that we actually included cyberbullying, and I was happy that they agreed to include it, just to the extent that we wanted to know what's the prevalence, what's the perception. It wasn't a deep study on cyberbullying per se, but we just wanted to get a sense of what the population was feeling in terms of cyberbullying, and the response was in a sense unsurprising. The vast majority of people, percentage wise of Caribbean people, think that this is a major problem. Um, what we were unable to do, which is unfortunate, is that we weren't able to target the research to understand what level of cyberbullying is perpetrated against women versus men or boys against girls. I think that that was a major weakness, but that's something that we probably need to look at in future studies. But what we found was that women were more likely to believe that cyberbullying was a larger problem than men. We also found that caregivers were more likely to believe it is a problem. Persons who are not caregivers were less likely to actually know whether it was a problem or not. They were more likely to be uncertain. And again, that is entirely unsurprising because invariably there's a direct correlation between women and caregiving. And as a result, we would expect that that would enhance the extent to which people are sensitive to the issue. What was also interesting is that we asked people about if they're familiar with the case of cyberbullying, and we found that over 20% of people across the region-wide, felt that there was an incident of cyberbullying with which they were familiar. That's quite high, because if you say that of the survey that we asked randomly, 1,000 people, they were able to say 20% of them were able to say that they know of a case, unless people knew of the same case. The fact is that is a fairly high penetration, because the reality is that a lot of cyberbullying goes without people knowing. So the level of awareness that there's a problem is high. And the good thing, however, is that the vast majority of these cases apparently were reported. So about half of those cases that were people were aware of were reported. And interestingly enough, there was also a conviction among a significant part of the population that the police could actually investigate and report these crimes, because a huge part of the problem, and I'm sure that Kono would agree, that is that people tend to think that these things are not crimes. Explicit photos shared and stuff like that. It's not something that people believe is prosecutable in many instances. Not because they are, indifferent to it, it's because they don't know. And we did find that people felt that this was something that the police could investigate and prosecute. So that's a good basis. So I would say that there is an awareness regionally. There is a level of knowledge that this is a problem that exists. There is an interest in pursuing it, and there's a belief that the state has the capacity to pursue it. So one could say that we've made a start, and I definitely think that we have a good direction in terms of future research, because if you were to dig down, we need to know the gender, whether boys or girls are more impacted, and then the extent to which the socioeconomic status or the exposure to social media can be a factor, because I'm inclined to think that children who are more exposed to social media, children who have greater access to those facilities, are likely to be more at risk. So these are the kinds of things that I would love to explore in future research on this matter.
Hi, just to follow on to what Peter was saying. Again, sometimes a case may become prominent in the public, in the traditional media, and sometimes that's what people hear about, and jump on that bandwagon as it's now blown completely out of proportion. It's a huge problem. I do think also And I agree that, we do need to do much more research, and we have, some basic findings and so on in terms of abuse, online abuse, as well as other against boys and men. Because when we do our workshops, that's something they always point out, that they too become victims of, particularly if they are involved in sports, um, to being, what's the word I want to use? Approached sometimes very aggressively by women, and that doesn't often get reported or spoken about. They will privately one-on-one with the guys in our workshops, but that's not something they're going to speak about, because that is, again, something of shame, or why are you pushing off this older woman? But for a lot of the boys, it bothers them. So I just wanted to put that on the table as well. Although the focus is about violence, cyber violence against women and girls, but we do need to look at the boys as well.
Stuart, how is the High Commission of Canada supporting the work to end digital violence against women and girls?
One of the big things that we've done in the last couple of years was working with the UN ODC to reduce sexual exploitation online. And that was really a big campaign where we went around Trinidad and Tobago to educate schools, teachers, parent-teacher organizations, police, the judiciary on how to identify when something is going wrong and how to prosecute these crimes. And then to the students and to the teachers, really how to protect yourself online. And it's really simple stuff like don't give your name when you're speaking to somebody online. Don't give your real name. Don't say where you live, and these types of things. And then another big advocacy point for the activists all across the region is when we have 16 days of activism. This is a really great opportunity for us to help our friends and our colleagues, our allies, to get the message out. And that's why we're so happy working with you and Echo and the WeTalking boys. And we're here today.
Peter, what challenges remain in detecting or prosecuting online digital violence?
I mean, even anecdotally, I think a big part of the problem is awareness. In that, if people, I think, are too willing, to, especially children, to shrug off cyber violence as par for the course. It's just something that happens and ignore it. So at a baseline level, that's a challenge because a lot of people are not even aware that these things are offenses. And one of the things that we discovered in our previous iterations of the study even was that the whole concept of what is a private part, where the presumption, for example, is that a topless photo of a boy is not offensive, while a topless photo of a girl is. Um, pictures of hands and feet, things like that. A lot of people are not even aware that they can be offensive in a particular context. And things like that are exchanged. I think that there's a vulnerability really for people who may have these peculiar fetishes and may attempt to convince young boys and girls to participate unknowingly in sharing this kind of imagery without the knowledge that it is actual. And that was probably one of the more distinct findings in the previous iteration of the survey, where we asked people about private parts. And generally speaking, people assume that the traditional the breast of the girl, not of a boy, the penis, vagina, and the bottom to a lesser extent, but that's really where it started and ended. So I would say that level of information is critical in terms of the definition, and then secondly, the legislative framework and the capacity of the legislative framework to respond to something like this. So if you look at revenge porn, which is a basic challenge, in many instances there's an assumption that the pursuit of revenge porn will be embarrassing and challenging, and that there are no safeguards in the law in many instances to protect both parties. So that's one thing. I think that the knowledge of legislation's ability to deal with it, and indeed the legislation's ability to deal with some of these challenges, is critical, because in many instances the legislative framework is not up to par. The other thing is something as basic as exploiting someone for money, which is blackmail. There's an incredible misunderstanding that blackmail is not something which is prosecutable. We had a fairly notorious case in St. Lucia recently where a minister was essentially prosecuting a young girl for blackmail in a situation like that. Now, that case was troubling in many instances, but it was also useful in others because it demonstrated in very stark terms, that it could go both ways. So you could have a young girl attempting to blackmail an older man by way of using photos that they intended to publish, and this one was it was played out in the press. So that facility to prosecute for blackmail is something that's available already and is largely underutilized because I think that is often a share. And I think that, those are some of the issues I believe need to be dealt with. So we have the legislative part of it, in terms of the capacity of the state needs to be increased and heightened with safeguards for people who are making complaints, and that's absolutely important, privacy and so on. And then on the other hand is the basic knowledge and understanding of what exactly is offensive. I also had a note here about the idea of unsolicited photographs. Again, a presumption that the only photograph that will be problematic is a photograph of you, as opposed to a person sending you a photograph of them, which in many instances is unsolicited, can be offensive and can give rise to prosecution. And if someone is sending you nude photos of themselves, which you're not interested in seeing, you have not asked for, and certainly are inappropriate, especially if there's this huge age differential in some instances in regard to children.
So I was listening to Peter and I'm nodding my head because we see the same challenges, and the challenges he identified are something that we're tackling in we're in Guyana as it relates to public awareness. So we had a campaign, I think it was last year, on cyberbullying and cybercrime, because we have a cybercrime legislation that kind of penalizes persons for these similar offenses. So we realize the same thing. Persons don't know that this is a crime and you can make a report, and so we have done very, very, very many public awareness campaigns. And what we did is that we started it in schools. We started it in the primary schools, secondary schools, and then into the workplaces. And then we kind of tie into the workplaces our Sexual Offenses Act, which kind of bridges some of those offenses in terms of sharing unsolicited photographs, in terms of sharing messages, whole revenge porn and everything, because sexual assault is kind of wide. And so persons are of the opinion that, okay, it's sexual assault in their mind is just if you were raped, but it's not. There's so much more. And so we have embarked on a campaign to let persons know of all the offenses and all of the ways that they can get help. So that's something we did across the country in all of our regions. I think we reached quite many persons. And so in addition to that, what we did too is that we have certain programs targeting the younger population, targeting our females, and we even have a program targeting our men, because the reality of it, if you look at the statistics, if the perpetrators of these crimes are mainly men, yes, there's a high percentage of women now who are doing this, but the high majority of perpetrators are men. And so we realize, okay, we're telling them this is what you must do, this is how you can report, this is what you should not do. But then we need to also target the persons who are the offenders. And so we have launched a campaign where we're talking to the men about accountability, about healing, because a lot of it stems, there's a whole cycle, there's a whole cycle when it relates to why persons do what they do. And so we're trying to get to the root of it. We have a program we just launched this year, a policy dedicated to working with men and boys on many, many factors, not just abuse, but many other things. And so we realized that talking to the men is another way of getting the message across, and also working on the problem from their perspective, also while we're raising awareness of it, and also while we're sensitizing. We even sensitize the police. Okay, these are offenses, because we have a lot of persons in the force who are coming and going and changing. And so sometimes the police officers, you come and make a report and they don't even know that it's an offense. So we also work with them as well to let them know that, okay, these are offenses. Somebody touches you inappropriately, I can make a report. I don't feel comfortable with somebody and they said something to me that I felt assaulted sexually, I can make a report. So we're working and we have our challenges. As Peter highlighted, we do have some of the same challenges. But those are some of the things that we're doing here to kind of mitigate those challenges that we're having.
So same here in Jamaica. So the VPA, we have this We Talk project, as I said, and we call it Big Man Thing, which is a phrase used in Jamaica, and I'm not sure how widespread it might be in other Caribbean countries. But basically, it implies, this is serious stuff. This isn't joke. This isn't a joke business, but it speaks to um, men being serious about things. And so we're doing some sessions with. We literally just started this year. Came in partly with the project, um, working with boys in high school as well as out of school youth, and also led who we consider to be influencers in the sense that not necessarily social media influencers, but their work takes them and has them informing maybe like a wider section of people than we could reach. And the focus in it is about reducing gender-based violence, but we are approaching it from, as you were saying, Dr. Husbands, the approach being sort of about whether we call it positive masculinity or, being responsible and so on. Um, some of the challenges that we have seen coming, um, certainly for the schools, there have been some loss, particularly amongst boys after COVID. And, we are definitely going to be seeing this after Melissa. But literacy and, being able to understand certain things. So, personally, when we present the legal aspects and what's actually criminal, that creates a lot of discussion because, again, as you said, Peter, a lot of people just aren't aware that certain things are crimes. That's nothing. You hear little 8-year-old boys looking at a video about incest and, we're saying that, no, nothing that. But it's so the public awareness isn't as consistent as you would like. We have organizations that will do um, certain, we'll have certain days or, Thursdays in black or whatever it is. But certainly the awareness about the criminal aspect of certain behaviors we need to highlight. And the boys and the older men that we've engaged have been very, very interested in that aspect of it because they just don't know. And, there are a lot of things that they gather across media and from peers, but really don't have sufficient information. And even if you do posters or handouts and so on, the literacy and comprehension level, among some of the boys that we engage with is challenging. And the social norms are so deeply embedded. So there's a lot of work to do, and would love to hear more from Dr. Husbands about some of the work and materials you use, particularly in primary schools, um, because we know that we need to start much younger than we are. We are actually going to try and start working with the younger high school boys. We were working with the top end, but we realized that both those boys, the guidance counselors, said start with some of the younger boys, not just us. So, yeah, I agree. We do need to start much younger.
Okay, so Colleen, have you seen a increase in behaviors attributed to displays of masculinity that may be gained on digital platforms being exercised against women and girls in your work?
Well, certainly a lot of the teenage boys, um, how they're learning about sex and so on very often comes from porn. And porn is very often, very violent and so on. So that's a major one. Um, and certainly there is again. I go back to some of the sociocultural norms of being pushed by women who will say, if he doesn't beat me, he doesn't love me, and that if he's not rough and aggressive in how he expresses his feelings for me, then he's soft. He's not a man, kind of thing. Um, so those are some of the challenges I think that some of the boys face in terms of how they learn, and they that the aggression and that type of behavior kind of gets reinforced digitally, but as well with some of the women that they encounter. So those might be two things to consider.
From our end, what we have noticed, okay, so we have a program. Only this year we launched it because called the Brave Circles, whereby it is a program targeting men and boys where we have them in conversations, similarly to what survivor support groups, but for men. And when we're having these conversations, the information that is revealed, it gets very deep. And what we realize is that a lot of men, you ask if how is the impact of digital media and so forth. A lot of men, that is their only source of any sort of guidance or information because they grew up without fathers. A lot of Caribbean men, a lot of Caribbean families. It's a lot of we have a lot of single mothers in the Caribbean. And so they don't have a role model. They don't have anybody telling them, okay, open the door for the woman. Okay, you don't have to hit her. They grew up in an environment whereby they don't know what to do. And so they would gravitate to the social media, they would gravitate to the internet. And as Colleen said, okay, they're looking at the porn and it's very aggressive towards women and they're thinking, okay, this is what I should do. This is and they're afraid to talk because you can't go to your mother and say, okay, mommy, what should I do? So and when they do meet up with the other men, because we're getting all of this from the brave circles, when they meet up with the other men who don't have fathers as well, the conversations that they're all talking the same thing, which they really don't know. So that is a culture, and it's deep rooted. As I said, we have a lot of a lot of women headed households, and then you can. I mean, as a Caribbean person, I can't go to my mother and say, "Mommy, I want to talk about this. Mommy, I want to talk about that." As a young man. So we do see that, and I think that's what is manifesting now in some of the behaviors of our young men and even our older men, right? So that's a serious shot. That's a serious issue that we found, and I think that came out of our engagement with the men and boys.
I'm thinking that the sex ed modules, which, well, certainly I would have been familiar with, which was my love for 30 years ago, um, would have started with, let's say at 11, or being a secondary school, 11 plus, and would have made certain assumptions of ignorance. And I think that that's one of the things that we're going to have to be frontal about, that our concept or the determination as to where we need to start having conversation with children, especially in school, certainly needs to be earlier, certainly considerably earlier, because the fact is that they're exposed for a long time before those conversations have legitimately started. And then the other thing is that we had to make assumptions in terms of what they would have seen and been exposed to. And frankly, deal with issues like, the fact that pornography is generally speaking artificial and often violent, and the kind of boundaries that need to be in place. Because I think that there's a definite line now where children appear to be exposed. Conversations that I've had with children suggest that they're being exposed to pornography from the time they're 5 and 6 years old. But yet still, it's not legitimate to have conversations with them until they're 11, about those realities. And, the fact of the matter is that what you're not being told in the home by parents or in the school by the institution, you're told by your friends on the playground. And I think that that's far more dangerous because it's uncontrolled information. And, there's a perception, certainly in Barbados, that you can avoid having conversations by not raising issues, when I just think it's quite frankly silly, to suggest that you could not. There's no need to have certain conversations with an 11-year-old about the feelings and what they're seeing and sex and whatnot, because the reality is that they have probably been having those conversations with less informed people for a long time.
Yes, certainly. They're having those conversations really early and all sorts of variations. Um, and just talking back about some of the sex modules, I did recently hear a teenage girl, daughter of some friends, talking about they were so sick of this sex ed sessions that they were having in school because it was all about chlamydia and herpes and so on, but nothing about relationships. And it was preventing pregnancy and that's what the sex ed was. And, so I was overhearing her conversation with her mother about it. And, you know, that was the thing, it was a lot about the prevention and the fears of, oh my God, if you have sex, these things might happen, but nothing about the relationships. And again, we need to start from very early. How you relate to people. Um, what's a good touch? What's a bad touch? And to be aware of our bodies and know the names of things, and again, our media, not just social media, our music, does tend to reinforce a lot of things, and much as traditional radio may play the child rated or but not the adult rated version. They're hearing the adult rated version in dances in the neighborhoods and so on. They see the dances, and it's cute for the 3 and 4 year old to whine and walk up, but not for the 8 or the 11 or the 12 year old to be doing it, and so on. So there are these inconsistencies, and there are challenges, and it does fight against the public education that we're trying to push. And also, just as another side note, as we're working with the boys, um some of them do push back and say, are you just trying to make us into soft men, that no girl is going to respect or like? And no, we're saying we just want you to be respectful, and particularly we had issues. Well, one particular issue where somebody was taking us to task for celebrating International Men's Day, you know, um, and again, it's there's so many deep rooted issues and norms that we have to push against. But I think that's just the work that we have to do is to keep chipping away. Whether it's through schools, whether it's through workplaces, through social or traditional media. We find for us for the face to face, because we've been looking at how some of our social media messages about big man thing are seen and so on. And very often, and we try and get the data, as to how many views, how many shares, and all this sort of stuff. And it's primarily women who are looking at them, in vis-a-vis men. And so, like for the boys, we will have like a WhatsApp group, to make sure that they're coming to the next session. So we're now trying to get to them more directly through these WhatsApp groups that we're working with the boys at school. And hopefully they will share with their peers. But, putting it on Instagram and TikTok and so on, they get, some good views and shares, but it's a lot of women. And so, there are all these other ways that we need to be targeting men. We try and do as much, and we try and encourage the schools to start their own groups, especially if it's a co-ed school, to start their sessions with the boys, because they're asking for more. The older men are asking for more. They need the spaces to talk and share, um, and be vulnerable, without judgment and so on. So, there is a need for a lot more, because yes, we realize that men are the primary perpetrators, but we need to work with those perpetrators, work with other young men who may become potential perpetrators. So it's important to have those spaces so that men who may know of others who are perpetrators, or who may, in their desperation, do things that they probably normally wouldn't do, so there is a lot of work that needs to be done, to try and help them have that opportunity to speak and share about things that, maybe society says, it's not anything you can go home and talk to your mother about.
I think one of the things that I wanted to know if everybody would agree on is we mentioned in terms of the sources that our men and boys are seeking and are going to information from. Would we say they're being drawn to these sources particularly because of lack of willingness, um, particularly, for example, with family unit to share information and to have these conversations?
I don't think it's a lack of willingness. I think they just don't know where to go. And that's in my opinion. They don't know where to go. As Colleen said, the boys want to talk, the men have, because the thing is, when you have the space and you start to hear them talk, they flow, and sometimes we have to extend the time and tell, because they have a lot to say, right? But they just don't know where to go. One of the things we did, this was last year, but it's still ongoing. There's a program we developed. This is with UNFPA initially, called BOSS, Brotherhood Operating Safe Spaces. And what we did is that we realized we targeted persons where the men already have conversations, the barbershops, the coaches when they're playing football and they're playing cricket, and we targeted even the taxi drivers, because you can sit down, everybody gang up and we talking, and they talk about a lot of things. So what we did is that we targeted those persons who already have these informal groups, these informal conversations, and we trained them on positive masculinity, conflict resolution, anger management, resources for gender based violence, what it is, what it means, and so forth. So we equip them with the knowledge that if a conversation comes up, because they may be sitting in the barbershop, or, I give her to slap their boy, and whatever they may say. And then that person can now tell them, okay, this is wrong, this is what they should do. So we have done, because we realize that, as Colleen mentioned, we do have to reach them where they are sometimes. And so that's one approach that we took. And we realized it was very impactful because, as she said too, it's very, very hard to get men to come to gather in a space in terms of the time, because when you put it on a weekend, that's when they're working, or you put it during the week, and Sundays is the football day, and so it's very, very difficult to get them to come. So we realized that we had to be a bit unique and go where they are, and so that was an approach that worked. So it's not that I don't think they don't want to come. I think they just need to know where to go. That's my opinion. Thank you.
I like that, and that's an approach we were hoping to do with taxi drivers and fisher folk and so on. Um, we are going to get some fisher folk tomorrow, but in a different context now, because they've lost everything, not as people who will be, sharing with others, but hopefully. But to go back to the question, I think one of the, again, maybe it's not so much willingness. For a lot of people, it's trust. If I don't trust you, the boys will tell you at school, they're not going to the guidance counselor. If the guidance counselor is female, if the guidance counselor is male, they're not going to them, because they don't trust that they're not going back to the staff room to go and tell everybody about their business. Um, and similarly with some men, there are certain people that they just won't trust, or is there some sort of agenda? If you look a particular way, or is there some political agenda in here, or you know, or if are you coming with some economic benefit for me, then I'll be there and try and jump on it. But again, I think trust is very, very important in sharing. Is this somebody that I can relate to, that I trust what they're saying? Um, I wear another hat as Parenting Partners Caribbean, and we did some audio recordings, and we were testing them with teenage girls who had babies early, during the women's center. And when we asked them again, um, what was their reaction? Their reaction was they trusted the voice of the person because they found it experienced, and that they shared some personal insight. So it wasn't somebody sort of talking out and talking down to them, but somebody who sounded credible. Um, and and that seemed to be the same thing with the boys and even with the men. That the facilitators that we have worked in community. They've worked with men and boys in very vulnerable situations as well, and so they can draw on stories. They can draw on their own personal experiences, and I think that's something that resonates with the participants, and that they begin to trust. But it takes time, and that's part of the challenge. We can do an intervention for 4 2-hour sessions, but it might take 2 sessions for them to really start opening up and trusting you. but they definitely trust is something that's very important in making the case.
I just want to put it out there that I got two kids. They're 11 years old, two little boys, and I find it really difficult to go and find the resources to talk to them. Uh, and then I find it even more difficult to go and talk to them. It's an uncomfortable conversation for a lot of people, including me. And then the looks on their faces when I start to talk about this, just like squirming around and feeling really unhappy and trying to run away. And I'm also feeling the exact same thing inside, right? I want to run away from that as well. Um, so making it really easy and accessible, um, it's super, super important. To have a personal experience in that.
No, I can identify with what Stuart is saying. I'm not a father, but certainly an uncle. And in many instances, I've been happy that I'm an uncle and not a father because it means that I can avoid having uncomfortable conversations. And I have to admit that the odd occasion where I've been asked uncomfortable questions, it's always easier for me to say, you need to have a conversation with your mother or your father. Let's have a conversation with Uncle Peter because I do share your discomfort, but the fact of the matter is that these are conversations that have to be had. So I feel you on that one. The one elephant in the room though that I wanted to speak to, and this came up, it was particularly pronounced. We did some work in 2008 for government of Barbados on domestic violence and cyberbullying and so on as part of that whole conversation. And what we found was that the greatest threat and the greatest asset was probably from the church. Threat in the extent to which the presumption of this Judeo-Christian assumption that there's a rule for men and this type of thing, which is completely misunderstood and misplaced, but that has programmed a lot of behaviors. And I remember there was an excellent program in Grenada in which we took abusers, people who were convicted by the court of abusers. And, I was invited to have some sessions with them to talk about their thought process and stuff like that. And I mean, it was pretty disturbing. Once the woman left the room, the conversations went in a direction that essentially said that we're doing God's work. God wants us to be in control of our house and treat our women in this way because it's consistent with the writings in the Bible. They wouldn't say when the woman was in the room, but as soon as she left, then they had this perspective. So that's the threat. This has programmed a lot of the behavior. And then the asset is that, we found that when you asked women who is the first person that you would like to speak to if you were being abused, especially, I mean, they would always say the church. They don't want to speak to the pastor, the priest, the counselor in the church. So the opportunity for intervention is greater. So I'm taking this whole conversation and shifting it towards the idea of cyber violence and cyberbullying and saying that I think that a big part of this is a presumption on the part of believing communities, because the vast majority of us are, that these conversations are improper, these conversations are unchristian, and there is no need for these conversations if you bring the children up. There's a presumption that if you don't have conversations and if you behave in the way that you believe that God wants you to behave, then there's really no need to raise this issue. And my concern is that it just leaves children so vulnerable, in that kind of situation, because sometimes in the same church, there are bad influences and so on that may be putting them at risk. And then, as I said, the asset is the other part, that it is entirely possible that the Sunday school space provides a trusting environment in which children that have issues can go to people and raise them and have conversations with them, with the level of trust. So that to me is as I said, the elephant in the room that, we are afraid. And so when we dealt with domestic violence, the police and the other agencies were very, very afraid to confront this reality that, you have to break down this presumption that, that this is something that's biblically inspired and that, particular behaviors, especially male behaviors, are expected and endorsed. And that's something that as societies we have to be willing to confront and move away from.
But would you say, Peter, would you say the willingness to learn, to learn / unlearn, particularly church and the other groups that you mentioned, so that they can position themselves, for example, to be proactive in terms of how they deal with cases, and also be proactive in terms of being spreading awareness, or you know teaching their, for example, the church congregations and persons that they interact with? Would you say there's a willingness to learn slash unlearn? What would you suggest in ways to engage, particularly religious institutions, in terms of digital violence, domestic violence, but allow them to be a safe haven for persons to share if they wish, but also be able to allow them to transition to the next step, whether that be reporting, whether that be seeking um, another form of professional help? Is there any work being done? And if not, what would you suggest to be done in order to reduce digital violence cases?
I have some views on it. I don't know if they are necessarily the right views, but I just wanted to say that information is key. And one would hope that if you provide these institutions with a knowledge of what's happening, the extent to which it is a problem, and indeed the correct channels to take. So, in terms of domestic violence, certainly there's nothing wrong with going to your pastor, but it ought not to end there. One of the issues that we encountered in Barbados was that the police force at the time, which would have been quite some time ago, 2008, they had internal regulations that encouraged officers who encountered cases of domestic violence to counsel the couple towards not breaking up the family. And it was interesting that the unit that pursued this matter was headed by a woman. And it was a female assistant commissioner of police who defended this position as being right, in a room. And I was appalled, quite frankly. Um, my concern is that when you're dealing with an institution like the church that may have similar ideas about the fact that marriage is sacred and it should not be disrupted in any way, um, you are essentially often sending women, generally women or men who are being abused, back into an abusive situation because you think that the worst thing that could possibly happen is that you get a divorce or you live apart. So what do you say to an institution like that? What I would say is you need to let that institution know that you are part of a process which can begin with you, but certainly the next step should be some authority that has the physical capacity to take the person out of that situation. One of the things that we did in Barbados when we did our protection orders legislation is that we introduced this idea of third party intervention, which means that I can report a suspected case of domestic violence that I hear at my neighbor's house. And the police have the power to enter my neighbor's house based on my complaint and investigate, and if necessary, remove one person from it, which means that it doesn't matter what you say to your pastor, it doesn't matter what you say to your friend. If this is something that's happening and we determine that it's happening, the state has the capacity to intervene and take the abuser out of that situation and prosecute them. And because the vast majority of instances, we found that the people who were being abused were the head ones that were discontinuing all these cases because, you would have the police wasting time preparing cases against men. And then it goes to court and the woman doesn't offer any evidence because she, fall back in love again. And I'm saying men or women not to say that that's the only thing that can happen, but I'm just speaking with reference to the cases I was familiar with. And I think that we had a problem in Barbados where a woman was killed. Well, not just one, but one in particular was killed after there was this long, long list of complaints. And it shocked us into action. And the Domestic Violence Protection Orders Division, which was something that had been talked about for years and years and years, it happened quickly. And, we had these kinds of protections that were inbuilt. Because I do feel that there's going to always be a limitation in terms of you're saying to an institution that believes in the sanctity of marriage, which is perfectly fine. I am married myself. But you're saying to that institution, you may very well need to take action to break up that marriage to protect someone who's being abused within the context of that marriage. There is only so far that you can expect an institution to go in that regard. And I feel that part of the conversation has to be that those institutions understand that the role is limited, the role is counseling and so on, but there's a regulatory rule that is paramount and that they have to be part of that process. So yes, you receive your complaint, but you also encourage the person to report to the authorities, or you report to the authorities in a situation where you believe that someone might be at risk. I think the worst thing that could possibly happen is for a church elder to hear of a young girl or a young boy being abused and believe that their role is to counsel the person who is being abused and not to ensure that the state gets involved to ensure that the abuser is brought to justice.
From what you've mentioned in terms of all these various areas, if we, for example, what is one reform that we can, that you believe, that any of you believe that we can realistically begin tomorrow, particularly when we look at tackling digital violence against our women and girls and as well as our boys? What is one reform that you think or that you believe we can realistically begin tomorrow?
Off the top of my head, I think we can use the same platform to let persons be aware of what is right and what is wrong. It's we know that the internet, how impactful it is, yeah, how many hours people spend on it and so forth. I have a 4-year-old son, and he would come and tell me everything he sees, everything. He's just like a sponge, soaks everything up. And we can use that medium as well to display the positive messages and to let people know, okay, if this happens to you, report it. And the other day, when we were even planning our 16 days campaign this year, persons were telling me, oh, Dr. Husbands, you can't have no long, long message. TikTok is 30 seconds, 60 seconds. I mean, stuff like this. So you have to be relevant and also reach the audience that we're trying to reach. So I think my thing would be get on the same platform, but just send positive messages and persons to know what what is out there and what is good and what is bad. Because as we all said, Colleen, Peter, even Stuart, that we don't a lot of people don't even know that these things are illegal. They don't even know. They don't know what they can do. Right. So I think immediately just start generating public awareness messages on these issues and put it out there because it reaches millions of people. It can touch so many lives. That's my thought.
Agreed. And what we, while we're focusing on boys and younger men, we also focus on older men as well as men in the workplaces, because we know that things are going on. And as you were saying, Peter, the information is we can whittle it down. We can use images um, to portray certain things. Certainly for our 16-day, we had a draft that suddenly got derailed again. Sorry to keep pushing it, but it's not going away. Is Melissa? So we're changing about 5 of our messages so that it's reflecting men being not just being supportive of women and to stop perpetrating violence and so on, but to being supportive, particularly in the context that we are in now, because we do know that in disasters and so on, the violence, particularly the intimate partner, the GBV, is gonna go up. People are out in shelters, just out in darkness, really. Um, and so for children, for women, for elders, and for any vulnerable person, we need to be supportive. And so we're going to be changing some of our messages to focus on being supportive within the context of a disaster. So that's something pretty immediate that we're going to be doing. And as you're saying, using the platforms to reach as many as we can.
Colleen, Dr. Husbands, what advice would you have for people like, for example, myself, Stuart, and Peter, who may have to have these difficult conversations? um, when we find discomfort in answering these questions, what advice would you have for us?
Oh,
On
I'm
how
ready for
should
this
we
one.
answer these questions?
Please bring it on. Bring it on.
No, what I must say is that you should endeavor to be honest. Yeah, endeavor to be honest because we do have, as I said, remember I said earlier that when they don't know, then they have anybody to talk to, they go online and they will get the information, right? So when you say, okay, kissing is bad and they go online and they see something else, I'm just saying, just try to be honest. I think honesty and sincerity is important. And that also, what Colleen said, builds trust. Once they trust you, once you've established that connection as a parent, as a mentor, then they will come to you with more and more difficult conversations, and you guys will be able to relate. So once you start it, just be honest and be truthful. If you don't know, say you don't know. Don't give some answer that you may think you know, and they go back and be like, "Oh, daddy's lying or uncle is lying," and then they wouldn't come back to daddy or uncle. Yeah, so that's my advice.
Agreed. Certainly, and whoever doesn't have kids yet, if you do have kids, start really early. Giving them the proper names for parts, and utilize the media that they use. So if they're watching cartoons or whatever it is they're looking at on their iPads, be aware of what it is, because some things have they embed certain little messages, or they're for the kids, but there are some other little things that an adult will pick up. So watch things with them, and engage in conversations um, about certain things. You'll have your kids who might see kissing on television, and you know want to hide their eyes, or so on. And again, just jump in, and you have to be vulnerable, and show that you want to have the conversation. And if you don't know, you're going to find out. Or let's find out together. How can we find out? Maybe you're both going to go on the internet to find some information. Where are you going to go? Is this a trusted person that we're hearing on the internet? They don't sound too right. Let's find something else, and maybe do it together. And admit to you're feeling uncomfortable. Why are you feeling uncomfortable? Maybe you didn't have the conversation with an adult male when you were a kid, so you don't have a reference point. But start finding it.
So I wanted to ask, in terms of when we look at allyship and how do we move men from a position of cause to one of solution, how can we work together to end digital violence against women and girls, but also as an extension, ending digital violence amongst young men and boys?
Forget about Canada. I mean, so much of our efforts have been focusing on empowering women and girls, and that's a super important part. 60 Days of Activism, of really bringing out half the population, so that there's a equality. And in the Caribbean, very quickly, speaking with people around this table and others, that it's also very important to empower young men and boys, so that they're feeling confident and comfortable. When they're feeling confident and comfortable, they're not going to be abusive. And that's one of the very important ways to break some of the cycles of violence, and those exist in Canada as well. And one of the things that we're working on in Canada as well. So in Trinidad and Tobago, we really shifted our approach to re-engage and refocus on men and boys as well as women and girls.
Yeah, no, allyship is for me is huge. I discovered the power of allyship relatively recently, because I always assumed that if you're gonna have to deal with empowering a woman, then you have to empower her by way of empowering her. Basically, what do you do in that regard? And I've looked at this issue with respect to domestic violence, with respect to the involvement of women in politics, and with respect to the LGBT movement. And what I found interesting is that there's this nexus in all three regards, that the most powerful allies of women in politics are men in politics. The most powerful allies of the LGBT community are straight people. And the most powerful allies of women in relation to situations of domestic violence is men. So I'm a big fan of allyship, and I do believe that in respect of this particular issue, what we have to do is we have to work with the other gender in terms of that is the perpetrator, to help them understand, what they need to do and not do. And I think that young boys can be powerful allies. And again, I referenced this Grenada project, which was it was a UNICEF funded project where they went into high schools and attempted, but they basically spoke to young boys about, how they're supposed to behave in relation to women. and you do it in an environment where they feel comfortable enough to speak and so on, and they determine that when you speak to an abuser who is already being charged by the court or whatnot, that person is a lost cause. But you can do a lot to change your reality if you go to young boys and girls at 10 and 11, and you treat them about things like mutual respect, and the way to relate to women, if you like a girl, what you do or you don't do, and that type of thing. And I do think that what you do is you create allies in relation to the whole movement. I thought about politics earlier, and the places where women have done well in politics, in leadership, there's always been an ally that is there. And the ally is usually a male prime minister or a male leader that feels it is something that, he can do by advancing women in politics. That's a good thing to do. So allyship is critical, is key. I'm happy that you mentioned it. And I think that in respect to this peculiar problem we're having, we can create a community of allies that operate online, that know what should and shouldn't be done, and can create this kind of positive environment where they encourage a type of behavior by virtue of what they're doing.
It's basically merging Stuart and Peter's recommendations. Because what I've realized in our experience here from the government arm is that one person can't do it all. One person can't change everything, or one organization, or one establishment, or one agency. So as it relates to allyship, I think it speaks in addition to, okay, men supporting women, boys supporting girls. I mean, parents supporting children. We also have to, and I think we need support from the various stakeholders who are involved. I mean, digital violence, domestic violence, elderly abuse, all forms of abuse, they are multifaceted, as in, and the approach has to be that way as well. We can go into schools, talk to the children, and then they get the courage to make a report. Then they go to the police station and they're ridiculed and they're chased and so we also have to look at, so we got to now talk to, we have to get the buy-in from the police. They make it to the police station, they make that report, then they go to the courts, and then the magistrate, it's so, there's so many little things that they have to go through. And so we need support from everybody. I think I always say it, the churches, the judiciary, the police, even the community members. We have Guyana has developed a community advocacy program where we train persons who volunteer in the communities to report abuse and to work with families and so forth, because we realize that we can't do everything. As I mean, we, I'm talking about we as government, right? Government can't do anything. You need private partnerships, and you also need workplaces, the private sector, public sector, because a lot of persons spend a lot of time in these institutions, in homes, in schools, in workplaces. So I think the allyship is very important, but we also, including, it needs a wider reach in terms of all of our stakeholders. This is not just, it doesn't happen only in homes, it happens in schools, it happens in business places. We have a lot of sexual harassment complaints, and now it's happening digitally. So we do need the support of everybody, and we do need to empower them. That's what Peter Stewart was talking about. Empower our women, empower our boys, especially empower our young men to speak out. And when they do speak out, we have to have that little safety net, for them to be supported. And I think that's what we need to do.
Thank you. And just one last thing, and I do want to thank you all for joining me today. But as we final words from each of you, but also if there's any, for example, local resources or guidance that we can direct listeners to, that you may know of, feel free to share. But I'm just gonna, if there are any closing remarks, feel free.
Yeah, well, I want to thank you for giving the opportunity. And I also want to thank UNICEF for continuing to invest heavily in this kind of research that can help to enhance understanding. The reports that I referenced to, they're all available on the Eastern Caribbean UNICEF website, and it provides a useful resource as a starting point. But I also appreciate the fact that this process has helped to disseminate further information and has added significant value in the sense that I hear stories from the lived experience in Guyana and Jamaica, and also the work that's being done on Trinidad and Tobago. So I think it's been useful conversation. And I hope that there is a future to all of this in terms of policy initiatives and advocacy that can go forward. So thanks again. I appreciate it very much, the opportunity to participate in the conversation.
Yeah, maybe I'll just echo Peter's thanks to Renako and WeTalking Boys for putting together this again. We always love cooperating with WeTalking Boys. And 60 days of activism is a great time to do it. That being said, just people say 60 days of activism is a specific thing doesn't mean that we're not looking at this all year round. This is something that we need to continue working together on, whether it be government of Canada with the governments of the Caribbean or just on a personal level. I'm definitely going to go and have a talk with my kids in the next couple of days, and let's see how that one goes. So thanks very much, everybody.
Okay, well, it was great joining everyone and sharing. Thanks so much for the opportunity, and certainly we hope through Violence Prevention Alliance that we can continue to connect with our neighbors in the Caribbean, in Trinidad, Barbados, Guyana, everywhere, and let's keep the work going. Thank you so much.
I would like to say thank you all for the opportunity to be here and share. I always like it when I get to share with regional partners just to learn their experiences and what they're doing on the ground. I've made several notes. So and thanks to UNICEF for facilitating this, and We Talk Boys. I wrote you down too to start following you. And just to say that I do hope, as I said, the Caribbean, we have we're a similar culture, even Canada, because a lot of Caribbean people I know are there too. And so I think the message, I really applaud We Talk Boys and everybody who's working with this to get that message out. And I applaud the efforts. And I do hope it does reach where it needs to reach. And we can have further conversation as such. This may just spark other stories. So thank you for your time.
And just like that, we've reached the end of this powerful episode of WeTalking. Big thanks to our guests and to you, our listeners, for tuning in and staying a part of the conversation. Remember, the digital world is the real world, and every click, share, message, and choice can build safer spaces for girls, women, and boys in our region. If you enjoyed today's episode, share it with a friend, cousin, coworker, or that one WhatsApp group that always needs the message. Feel free to comment hashtag 16 Days of Activism 2025 or hashtag NGBV to show your support in ending violence against women and girls. Until next time, keep thinking, keep growing, keep WeTalking, and follow us on Instagram at WeTalkingBoys246 and look out for our next episode.